Okay, welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 15. So in this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about critical thinking, and I'm going to introduce you to what is critical thinking. So we have three objectives in here. First, we're going to understand what critical thinking is. What does it mean to be a critical thinker? Second, we're going to talk about the steps of critical thinking and how to apply those steps when you're thinking critically about something. And then at the end of the lesson, we're going to review three images critically to practice with our critical thinking. After this lesson, move on to Lesson 16. So let's start with a brief review since we're at the beginning of a new unit. In Unit 1, leading up to Essay 1, I introduced you to the structures of writing, different types of writing, and we talked about argumentation and how to make an effective argument. Then in Essay 2, we talked about academic writing and how to read, summarize, quote, and respond effectively to sources. So when you're engaging in an academic dialogue and you want to do some academic writing, first you need to understand an author's ideas and accurately summarize them, and then you'd respond to them. And we talked about how when you respond to a source, you're either agreeing with that source or disagreeing with what that source is saying. And we talked about how to agree effectively and how to disagree effectively and how to develop your responses. You're also going to be expected to question your sources critically by using critical thinking. So when most people think of critical thinking, they think of negative thinking, like this guy with lots of angry thoughts, or they think of reviewers who are just sort of hypercritical and never like anything. And it's true that that is critical thinking. But in reality, critical thinking could be either positive or negative, because critical thinking means looking below the surface of something to see how it works. So when we think critically about something, we're not just passively accepting something as it is or kind of going along with the crowd, keeping things status quo or the way they are. We're questioning, and we're asking, what is below the surface here, or how does this work? When we question the things we see, read, or hear, we wonder to what extent they are truthful or could be better. So, are the things that we're receiving the truth? Or if we're thinking critically about a process or something, is there a way that this process could be better? So in this sense, critical thinking is a really important skill for college, since college professors will want you to consider what it is that you believe is the truth, and what is the best way of doing something. A lot of professors will ask you to do these things all the time. And in order to do those, you need to think critically. So critical thinking is really one of the most fundamental and one of the most important skills, not just for college, but for every industry. So in education, teachers need to constantly think critically about the lessons that they give, and if there are better ways to teach their students. In manufacturing, businesses need to constantly think critically about their processes and whether or not there's a more efficient way to make certain products. In psychology, counselors need to think critically about the techniques that they use and about the issues that their patients might face. Finally, all leaders need to constantly think critically about their leadership strategy and whether or not they believe there's a better way to lead. So in this sense, critical thinking is a really broad term and a really broad skill. I once had a professor tell me that effective critical thinking is really the entire point of college. So we come to college to learn how to think critically about our particular industries. And that's almost more important than actually knowing things about your field or industry. So content knowledge is not as important as being able to think critically effectively. It's one of the most important things to get out of college. However, critical thinking is not easy to learn. It's very difficult to learn because the nature of critical thinking is thinking against the grain or thinking outside of the box, or not doing something the way that it's been done before or always been done, but sort of changing something up and thinking in new ways about it. So in this sense, a strategy for critical thinking kind of goes against the entire point of thinking critically. However, there are some general steps that most critical thinkers use that I can show you that'll help you to be a critical thinker. So as a general rule, there are 5 steps or stages of critical thinking. And they are summarizing, being able to put into your own words what a thing is or what it's about. Analyzing, breaking something up into little parts. Inferring, drawing little conclusions about those little parts. Synthesizing, thinking back about a whole with a new knowledge gained from an analysis. And evaluating, making some kind of ultimate judgment or decision as a result of your critical thinking. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at these 5. So summarizing is the first step. So good critical thinking always starts with summarizing the big picture. Generally, what is the thing that you're going to think about really about? Or what is it? If you want to think critically about a process, what is the process? If you want to think critically about a lesson, what is the lesson? If you want to think critically about a strategy, what is the strategy? After you've summarized, a critical thinker analyzes, which is really the heart of critical thinking. It means to divide something up into smaller parts and look closely at each of those smaller parts. If you're thinking critically about a process, what are the steps in the process? If you're thinking critically about a lesson, what are the parts of the lesson? If you're thinking critically about a strategy, what are the components of that strategy and implementing that strategy? Once you break something up into parts and look closely at those parts, you want to draw inferences, which are basically smaller conclusions about each of those parts. So you say, what's the conclusion of this part? What's the conclusion of that part? What's the conclusion of this part? What's the conclusion of that part? What's the conclusion of this part? So if you're thinking critically about a process, what do you think about each of the steps or each of the parts? Is each step or part as efficient as possible? If you're thinking critically about a lesson, does each part of the lesson work well? Or do some parts of the lesson not work that well and need to be revised? If you're thinking critically about a strategy, does each component work well in the strategy? Or are there some components of the strategy that you're going to have to rethink? After you infer, you want to synthesize. And synthesize basically means bring together or combine all the information learned through the analysis and look at the whole. So here's a graphic I found online. Synthesizing is sort of putting the pieces back together, right, with your new knowledge. I found this other graphic that shows synthesis is kind of the opposite of analysis. When you analyze, you break something up into smaller parts and look closely at each of those parts. When you synthesize, you have several parts and you bring them all together and think about the whole. So basically you think overall about the entire piece with the knowledge that you've gained. After synthesizing, the final step of thinking critically is evaluating. So the whole point of thinking critically about something is to either make some kind of a decision or come to some kind of a conclusion. And that's what you do in the evaluation step, is you make some kind of a conclusion. Yes, this thing is good, it's working well. No, this thing is not good, it's not working well. There are some things we need to fix. Some things work well, other things don't work that well. So if you're thinking critically about a process, you make decisions about where you might modify that process. If you're thinking critically about a lesson, you might make decisions about how to proceed with that lesson. If you're thinking critically about a strategy, you might make decisions about that particular strategy and how you might change it. So those are the important steps for all critical thinking. So let's practice thinking critically about images. So we could think about anything. We could think critically about text, and we are going to think critically about text in some lessons coming up. But I think it's really nice to start with images at first, because we can look at several images and practice some of those critical thinking strategies. So let me show you one image. Here's one. So let's think critically about this image. So we might start here with a summary. Basically, it's a guy with a computer on his head in the woods. Right? That's the sort of general gist of the big picture. And then we want to analyze. So if we're going to analyze this picture, we're going to look at what are the different components of this picture. Well, one component is he has a computer on his head. Another component is he's wearing a suit. Another component is his arms are sort of down by his side. Another component is the trees in the woods in the background. Another component is this sort of dirt road. So those are the pieces that comprise the image. Then we want to infer about each of those pieces, or basically draw some mini conclusions about each of these pictures. So he has a computer on his head. That kind of means that the computer is replacing his head, or he has a computer for his head, or maybe he thinks a lot about computers, or he's stuck inside a computer. He's also wearing a suit, and so that means that maybe he's a worker. Maybe he works in a corporate industry, and it could be a place where he's on the computer a lot. He also doesn't seem very happy, and we can tell that by his posture. His arms are sort of down by his side. Also, if we see this computer as his head is kind of tilted down, which means maybe he's a little sad or unhappy. So there's all of these components of the picture which maybe comment on this man's use of the computer or dislike of the computer, since he doesn't seem happy. But there's also these components. He's outside. He's not inside, but in the woods. And so the fact that he's in the woods is kind of ironic, because you usually wouldn't have a computer in the woods, and they don't seem to be very useful in the woods. So there's kind of that ironic aspect, the fact that he's in the woods. Also, since he seems depressed, maybe he's depressed about having the computer on his head. He's not sort of enjoying the woods or this particular area. So here we've analyzed and we've thought critically about each of the components of the picture, or inferred about those components. Next, we want to synthesize. So when we synthesize, we bring it back and think about the whole. So overall, this picture seems to be conveying some kind of message about technology's role in our life. I would say maybe technology is consuming our thoughts and our activities, and we can't get away from it. Also, maybe it's distracting us from the real world and interacting with nature. I think that's what this picture is trying to show us. And so we have this understanding that that's what this picture is about after thinking critically about this picture. So that's why critical thinking is so important, so we can bring it back and look at the whole. And then we can take it to the next step, and we can evaluate. Is this an effective message? And I would say, yes, it is pretty effective. I think it's definitely effective because it makes a powerful point, which is that technology does consume our lives. And I agree with the author of this image that probably we don't notice the real world as much as we could because we're too consumed with our devices. This is even an older computer. I think a more modern picture would, include somebody with a cell phone for a head. So that's something that could be updated with this picture. Is maybe it could be more modern with cell phones, because that's really where technology is kind of interacting with our life. So we could say that, or somebody else could say, no, this isn't really that good of an image because it's kind of a cliche message, right? Everybody tells us all the time, oh, computers are sort of ruining our lives and they're distracting us from the world. But I actually think that I have an enhanced experience of the world through my use of computers or through the use of cell phones. So this image maybe is cliche, and we say, no, it doesn't work. So that could be the ultimate conclusion here, is to draw some kind of decision or draw some kind of a final idea about the picture. So there's one. So there's a good sort of critical thinking about the image. We've looked below the surface of the image. We've thought about how this image works, and that's what you want to do. Let's take a look at another image. So here's another one. And right away, this one probably strikes us as being racially charged. But let's look a little bit below this surface. Basically, it's a picture of some cops grabbing a man with dogs. If we look at the components of the picture, so that's the sort of general summary of the big picture, if we analyze it, we look at the components of the picture, we can see that these police officers are both white. This one seems to be grabbing this man in kind of a violent way, and he's also holding this dog's leash in a way. The dog is another component of the picture. He's attacking this man, and this dog also looks like he might be about to attack. The man looks kind of innocent in this picture. It looks like he's not really doing much. He's sort of falling back on his heels, like maybe the cop is grabbing him kind of violently. There are some people in the background that are kind of watching. There's a sign for a restaurant over here. We can kind of see a car over here. So when we analyze, we see these are the components of the picture. But then we want to infer, draw some little conclusions about these components of the picture. So we can say, and I already sort of said this, it looks like the way that he's grabbing him, this man is sort of acting violently or acting aggressively towards this man, and he is a white cop. This man also, I said, looks sort of innocent, and I guess that's because of the way that his body posture is. It doesn't look like he's doing anything aggressive to the police officer. He's also black. And so those two things, if we think about recent racial tensions between police and the community, might strike a chord with us, and we'd say this is a sort of unjustified grabbing of this man. The dog also looks particularly violent in here. Maybe the police officer has told this dog to attack, and we can see that because of the way the dog is sort of baring his teeth into the man. Some of the other components of the picture are these people in the background, right? This man in particular, he's sort of watching, but he also has his back turned like he shouldn't be watching. And some of these other people are also sort of watching, but from a distance. So that's an interesting part of the picture as well. Plus, this man's hat looks very old-fashioned. Actually, a lot of these guys are wearing hats, which means that maybe this is an older picture. And the police officers' uniforms look pretty old as well. Same with this sign over here. So this sign looks like an older sign, an older Coca-Cola advertisement. So maybe this image wasn't taken in modern times, but was from the 50s. Even the car looks a little bit old from what we can see of it. So if we make some inferences about these different components of the picture, we can say probably this picture took place, let's say, in the 50s, the civil rights movement. It looks about that time period. And it definitely sort of looks like an aggressive attack of this man. So if we synthesize, after looking at these different components, we would say, overall, this seems to be a picture of police brutality or discrimination. It doesn't seem like a justified arrest of this particular man because he looks innocent and the police officers look guilty. And these people in the background also seem to be at a distance, as if this kind of thing happens a lot. So we could synthesize and say that, and then we could even evaluate it and say, this is a very powerful picture because it depicts police violence or police brutality, which is something that's still going on even today. We have a lot of incidences of police brutality on people of color in cities, especially this year around the country. So this image might sort of really stir up some of the tensions or the passions surrounding that and capture the injustice of police attacks or police brutality. So we might say, yeah, this is a good picture. But somebody else might say, no, this picture isn't working well, and actually this is a pretty deceitful picture, because although it does look like this man is grabbing him aggressively, and it does look like this man is innocent, we can't really make those inferences or those assumptions about this picture, because he could be guilty. Perhaps, if we're sympathetic with police officers, we might say, these police officers might just be doing their job. Perhaps this man has made a threat, or has a weapon, or has some kind of drugs on him, and the police are making a justified arrest. So we don't know that this is necessarily a picture of police brutality. And somebody who would say that might also say, actually, this is a very dangerous picture, because most people would probably draw the assumption that this is about police brutality. And so if this was published in a magazine or something, it would spread this sort of rhetoric that police are abusive to people in the community, and that might really incite tensions more. So somebody else could say that about the picture. There's no right or wrong way to think critically about something. It's just justified and unjustified conclusions based on your analyses and inferences. So let's take a look at one more image. This is the bunny picture. So if we summarize it, we'd say basically it's a bunch of bunnies with their heads and things. If we analyze, we look at the different components of the picture more closely. So we'd say there's several bunnies here. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bunnies or so, and it looks like it might even go further down there. We can see their heads. They're in boxes. There's some kind of a table that they're on. In the background, there are some wires dangling. It also seems to be the back sides of bunnies over here, as if there's a whole nother row of bunnies facing the other way. So we've analyzed those are the components of the picture. So if we infer about each of those components, we would say they don't look very happy. I mean, bunnies like to be naturally out into the world, but here they have their heads trapped, they're immobilized. Some of them look like they might be a little bit frightened. They're also stuck in these metal things that are numbered. So whoever's doing this to the bunnies has some kind of a purpose, since they're numbered. They're not named. This isn't Fluffy and Peter Rabbit. These are numbered bunnies. So they're probably being used for something. And the metal things don't look very friendly or inviting either. In addition, these wires kind of hanging down here in the background sort of look like maybe the bunnies are hooked up to something. They're processing them in some kind of way or doing something to them. And the fact that there's even more bunnies in the background over here implies that this is probably a big facility and there's lots of bunnies in this place. So we've inferred about all these parts. Now we might want to pull it together with the synthesis. And we would say, so overall this seems like it's definitely a picture of some kind of animal testing facility, right? Since the fact they're numbered, it implies that they're probably definitely doing some kind of a test to these bunnies. We don't know what kind of test that could be. I know that a lot of makeup companies use eye tests, and this kind of looks like it might be a sort of eye testing apparatus, right? So that the bunnies are immobilized, they could test makeup products in their eyes. That could be. It is possible that they're going to maybe kill the bunnies for food. This could be a bunny breeding facility or a bunny farm, although I think it's less likely than the testing option. Also, it could be that these are Angora bunnies and maybe they're going to be shaved for their fur. That could be another possibility, although they don't really look like Angora bunnies. I think the testing is probably the most plausible and the most likely. Whatever's going on here, it's definitely not good news for these bunnies. And we're supposed to see this as sort of unjust and want to free these bunnies and help them out. So if we evaluate, we could say, yeah, this is a pretty effective image. It's definitely striking. It makes us want to help these bunnies and protect these bunnies. However, somebody could also say, maybe whoever took this picture has framed it in such a way that we see sort of the negative side of animal testing, but there are lots of benefits of animal testing that this picture kind of ignores. And if this is published in a magazine or something, somebody flipping through who sees it might be against animal testing as a result of seeing some kind of an image like this and say, oh, this is unjust. But in reality, animal testing does help us to create new medicines and to come up with new information about the way bodies work. So although this picture is definitely showing us the negative side, it doesn't have any of the positive aspects of it. So somebody might think critically about it that way and draw that kind of conclusion about the picture too. Just like the other one, there's at least two ways to think about it. Probably there's many ways to think about it. But that's it. So that's how you'd think critically. I think it works really well in the images, and soon we're going to sort of turn to text, and we'll talk about how do we do the same kind of thing with text. And as you can see, these stages help us to think critically well, since they give us a sort of strategy or procedure for doing critical thinking. So let's just wrap it up real quick with this lesson. So when you think critically about something, what you're really doing is looking below the surface or questioning something to understand how it works. Critical thinking is probably the most important intellectual skill that there is. And like I said, I had a professor who told me it's really the whole point of college is to become better critical thinkers. Most employers, all employers, value critical thinking. So you want to be good at thinking critically. Generally, people think critically with these 5 steps. They summarize, they analyze, they infer, they synthesize, and they evaluate. So when you think critically, try to work through these 5 steps. And just move on to lesson 16. And in that lesson, we're going to pick it up and talk a little bit more about critical thinking. And we're also going to talk a little bit about Aristotle's appeals of argument and how that applies to critical thinking. So I'll see you over there.